Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Chris Erskine, and I will be your professor for this lesson. And we're going to jump right into chapter 11. It's titled The Expanding Republic. So the election of 1800 is a unique election in American history because this is the first time that we have, other than George Washington, this is the first time that we have a really contested presidential, well, that's not true. We have a really contested presidential election in 1796 between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and John Adams wins. John Adams runs again in 1800, and he runs against Thomas Jefferson, and this time he loses. But this is a big election because Thomas Jefferson's vice presidential running mate, his name was Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr realizes that because he gets the same number of votes as Thomas Jefferson, that he can become the president if he really wants to become the president. So he pushes to become the president, and Congress, when it happens that you have a tie, as in this case, Congress has to vote to break the tie. So the question you might be asking is, well, if Aaron Burr planned to be the vice president and Thomas Jefferson planned to be the president, then why is that not going to happen? Well, it's like this. It's very simple. Because the Constitution did not say that two people can run together as president and vice president. It says that the person who gets the most votes wins the presidency. The person who gets the second most votes wins the vice presidency. And so in this case, the electors, the people that were voting for president, both cast each of their votes. Each elector got 2 votes. And each elector cast 1 vote for Thomas Jefferson and 1 vote for Aaron Burr. And so Congress has to vote to break the tie, and they have to vote 39 times. Finally, Thomas Jefferson wins because one of his enemies, Alexander Hamilton, says to Congress, really, we should be voting for Thomas Jefferson, not Aaron Burr. Thomas Jefferson is the least dangerous man. And so on that 39th vote, Congress votes to elect Thomas Jefferson. Now, of course, if you're Thomas Jefferson, you don't trust your vice president anymore. So looking at this first slide titled The Election of 1800, we're seeing a map. And we can begin to see here the United States kind of break into different political divisions. And so we can see we have 2 groups. We have different political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. But really it comes down to the Federalists, and the people who are against the Federalists, they're called the Anti-Federalists, and the Anti-Federalists are against a strong government, and the Federalists are in favor of a strong government. So going to the next slide, thinking about what the country looks like in 1800, not looks like kind of like if you were to see it, but the condition of the country in 1800. So Jefferson, when he comes into office, he pardons almost right away. He forgives or lets out of prison people that were held under John Adams' Alien Sedition Acts. Now, these acts put people in prison who did not agree and who did not agree with the president and published things in the newspapers against him. Thomas Jefferson begins to kind of push for more urban areas to grow. The industry begins to develop factories that made textiles or cloth or metalworks, so perhaps cannons that are working with iron. Migration west, people are beginning to push west. It really begins to push west after the American Revolution because now it's safe to move west. Women are marrying younger and they're having fewer children. And just in one generation, from one parent to the next child, the average family size drops from 11 to 8. Imagine a family where you only have 2 parents and 1 child, or perhaps 2 parents and 2 children today. But in 1800, but before 1800, the family size was 11, 2 parents and 9 children. And that was very normal, not just in the United States, but really around the world. Girls are now able to go to school, and that's a little bit misleading because really, even people that were going to school were only going for 2 or 3 months in their entire lives, unless they went through to college. But most people were not going to school at this point, or not for very long. Native Americans began to move west. The Indians began to be pushed west, rather. And the Atlantic slave trade, trading slaves back and forth from Africa to the Americas, is against the law shortly after 1800. So looking on the next slide, the state of America, 1800, we see two columns, 1800 and 1850. And each of those columns, we have the names of cities and the population in each of those cities in 1800 and 1850. So you can look at New York as only in 1800, only 61,000 people. And in 1850, they have just over 500,000. That's 50 years. The growth is absolutely amazing that they have in 50 years. Philadelphia, the next one on the list, 41,000, and then 121,000. And Boston from 25,000 to 137,000. And then we move into cities like on the bottom three, we have St. Louis, Chicago, and San Francisco, that in 1800, we don't even have a recorded population for those cities. And by 1850, they're fairly large cities in the United States at the time. And these are the largest cities in the United States in 1850. Charleston today, 1850, has 43,000. Today, Charleston is not considered one of the largest cities in the United States. It's a fairly small city, actually, relative compared to a lot of other cities in the United States. Looking at the next slide, actually the next two slides, and if you look back and forth at these two slides, so look at one and then look at the other and then come back to this first one, what you see is what a map of the United States looked like first in 1795 up to about the late 1796. The next slide we have about 1800 is where this map picks up. And really what we're looking at here is that the Northwest Territory divides into two different territories. And then the state of Tennessee becomes a state by 1800. And we see a few other changes. Georgia splits off, and by 1800, we have the state of Georgia that actually is now much smaller. And this is the second map. This is what Georgia looks like today. And so the United States is changing and growing during this period. So I want you to flip back and forth in those two slides and look at those and just notice the differences between those two maps in just a couple of years. So thinking about Thomas Jefferson, really Thomas Jefferson is the kind of guy who everyone today would just really like. Thomas Jefferson is, he's a Secretary of State, he's ambassador to France, he's the Vice President of the United States, he's president. Before that, he was the governor of Virginia. He's a linguist. That's what we say when someone speaks several languages. He speaks English, of course. He speaks French. He speaks Greek, Latin, and several, he studies, he doesn't speak them fluently, but he studies several Native American Indian languages. He's also an architect. He's got a lot of time on his hands, and so he designs his own house, his own home. It's called Monticello, and we'll see a picture of that in just a second. But he also designs the campus of a very famous university in the United States, the University of Virginia. He's a scientist. He's the president of the American Philosophical Society. And he also not just designed the campus of the University of Virginia, which in the United States we call UVA. So if you're talking to someone and they say that they studied at UVA, that means that they studied at the University of Virginia. So he starts the University of Virginia, and he also writes the Declaration of Independence with John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. He's also one of the Revolutionary Founding Fathers. So very, very interesting person, Thomas Jefferson. Look at the next slide. It's a picture of Monticello. Now, this is where Thomas Jefferson lived for much of his adult life. Not while he was president. He lived in Washington while he was president. So Thomas Jefferson is a Republican. Now, when we say he's a Republican, we don't mean that he's a Republican and Democrat like today. The word Republican then just meant that you believed in a form of democratic government. So he wasn't connected to today's political party at all, today's Republican political party. He owns a library of about 7,000 books, and at the time, in 1800, this is one of the largest libraries in the world. So he's very, very interested in reading. He's against slavery, but how do we think about Thomas Jefferson in this context? Because He's against slavery, but he also owns slaves. He's a gardener. He likes to work in the garden. He is a botanist. He is an agronomist. He's a biologist. He studies all kinds of science. So he really is a scientific. He's got a scientific mind. He's a musician. He sings Scottish love songs, and he plays the violin. He plays Mozart, and he'll practice maybe 3 hours a day. So he's he's got lots of time to do these things. He's also an inventor. He invents a copy machine called a polygraph at the time. He invents a pedometer that will count your steps. He invents a code, a cipher wheel. He invents a kind of macaroni machine. He's a very interesting guy. And in English, we would say that he's a Renaissance man. So he's very interested in lots and lots of things. In 1782, Thomas Jefferson's wife dies. She's only 34. And for 4 months after giving birth, now it was very common at the time in the United States, in China, anywhere in the world, that women would die after giving birth to their children. Very common. And so Thomas Jefferson's wife, her name was Martha, she dies after 4 months after giving birth to their 7th child. So Thomas Jefferson was 39. Martha's only about 5 feet tall, so she's quite short. And historians and doctors think that probably she had diabetes, and so that was not good for her health anyway. She had been married before, but her husband had died. And so there's just so many people died early and very young when they were in 17 and 1800. And Martha Jefferson's own mother had died in childbirth, as did her first stepmother. Many women died in childbirth. It was very, very difficult to think about giving birth to a child, knowing that you might die when you gave birth to that child. Yet so many women had so many children. I mean, the average family size was, 8 to 11 just in one generation, quite a lot. And Thomas Jefferson writes that this was the most cherished companion of his life. And without her, that his life, he just lived in uncheckered happiness, while he was with her. And beside her deathbed, when he was there with her for most of the time, or most of her last weeks, he said he would never remarry again because he loved her so much. He didn't remarry. He didn't. But look at the next slide. It's just kind of a journal entry that he has written. It's called Renaissance Man. And this first one, these are things that people have said about Thomas Jefferson or that Thomas Jefferson has said. And I want you to read this with me. So I'm going to try to read it slowly, and I want you to follow along on this slide. It says, for 4 months that she lingered, he was never out of her calling. When not at her bedside, he was writing in a small room which opened immediately at the head of her bed. So he was always right there with her. The next one, after Martha died, his wife is Martha. After Martha died, he had to be led to his library, where he was inconsolable, in a state of insensibility, and where he stayed for 3 weeks. So no one, his wife, his most best friend, just died, and he's so sad. His daughter was named Patsy, and Patsy writes this third quote at the bottom. My aunts remained constantly with him for some weeks. When at last he left his room to ride out, from that time he was incessantly or always on horseback, rambling about the mountain in the least frequented roads, and just as often through the woods. In those melancholy rambles I was his constant companion, a solitary witness to many violent bursts of grief. So you can see he was just so sad when his wife dies. On their deathbed, they wrote this poem together. It was actually, they didn't write the poem. This was a poem that Martha Jefferson liked, but they would write this out, and we still have record of this poem today. But you can see in this letter that, what he writes at the top, and then she writes on the bottom, she writes on the top, and then he writes on the bottom. And Martha Jefferson is buried at Monticello, and Thomas Jefferson says, nay, even in the gates of hell, I will wait for Martha, for my dear comrade. So on the next slide, it says Jefferson. It's a picture of another woman. This is not Martha Jefferson. This is Martha Jefferson's half-sister. So Martha Jefferson and this woman, her name was Sally. Martha and Sally have the same mother. They have the same father, but they have different mothers. Now, Martha Jefferson was a slave. Martha Jefferson's mother was a slave. Martha Jefferson's mother, Sally Hemings' mother was a slave, and Sally Hemings' grandmother was also a slave. And all three of them had had children with their slave owner. And so when Martha Jefferson dies, Sally Hemings, a slave that Thomas Jefferson owns, is still living there. And Thomas Jefferson falls in love with Sally Hemings, or does he? Historians are not quite sure how to think about this relationship. And Thomas Jefferson never remarries, but for 30 years, probably about 30 years, he has an affair, he has a relationship with his own slave, his wife's half-sister, named Sally Hemings. Now, probably he was the father of her children. She was 22 or 23 years old when when the relationship began. At that time, Thomas Jefferson was 52. When he died, he doesn't free his slaves, but he does free all of Sally Hemings' children, but he doesn't free her. They leave Virginia, and they officially, their last name was Jefferson, and they live as white people, because by this time because their mother was only 1/3 black, and so they then are only 1/6 black. Sally Hemings dies in 1835, 9 years after Thomas Jefferson dies. And he doesn't set her free, so she continues as a slave. And so this is a very complicated story that we have with Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and historians really aren't quite sure what to make of this story. But it's a really interesting story, and you can read a lot more about it online. But we're going to take a break right now, and we'll see you back here in part 2 in just a few minutes. All right, bye-bye.